Okay, good morning everybody. This is the fourth day of our seminars, and today we'll have lecture by Knut Banai. Just some words. Knut Banai is art historian, art critic. She teaches in Tufts University, Boston, since 2007. And her focus, her research interests focus mainly on after-war, post-war and contemporary construction of new publics through visual arts and the constitution of modernism through transnational exchanges, modernism and its aftermath through transnational exchanges. She's been contributing to RES journal, Archaeology and Aesthetics, and currently she's contributing to art papers and regular contributor to Artforum International. So, yeah, let's start.
Thank you. Thank you, Harut, and I'd just like to thank the organizers for inviting all of us here together. I'm very, very happy to be in Yerevan and to be part of this experience. And I hope to have very, very tough questions from the audience. So please pose critical, difficult questions to be the best outcome possible. So the title of my talk, Performative Geographies When Art and Politics Collide in Zones of Conflict, comes out of, I just want to contextualize what this comes out of. It's a project that I've started recently called Imagining Europe. And Imagining Europe is a project that begins circa 1945 and goes to the present, but has many different moments in its writing and in its construction. And basically it asks how Europe, which has been a kind of unresolved political problem and an economic one as well, has also been an aesthetic, cultural, and material imaginary. And my question is how practices, visual, cultural, aesthetic practices, have been participating in the project of imagining Europe as this elusive construct. And within that, the kind of civic consciousness of its people, of its demos. And the reason why this is important for me as an art historian is because, at least in the kind of received structures, theoretical, historical, modernist structures, this problem of Europe, which is kind of central, has not been part of the narrative. There's been this overarching question of avant-gardism, overarching question of East and West in some kind of paradigmatic way, but I'm trying to provide to fill a lacuna, if you will, of how artists who have been normally kind of relegated as apolitical have in fact been articulating history, first of all, through different means, and also have been part of this project of imagining Europe. And the reason why this is also important in terms of the global now and the kinds of questions that we're asking about today is particularly in relationship to the construct of modernism and how modernism itself has in the conflict or the tension between universality and particularism has already been a problem of, obviously, of the nation state, but also of the post-nation, and how aesthetic practices, which have been, again, kind of ironed out of many of their political implications, have been part of this narrative and have been actively constituting it. So that's the large project. And this is a part of it which looks at the role of biennials. And so really I'm looking at very official culture. the role of biennials in contributing to this collective imaginary, and the way that discourses provided and by the nation state have been both embedded within biennial culture, but also complicated by it. So I'm looking at the most official type of work you can imagine, the Documenta, 1955, the Paris Biennial, 1959, and Manifesta, 1996 to the present. And so I'm really looking at official culture. All right, so when art and politics collide in zones of conflict. So according to French political theorist and philosopher Etienne Balibar, quote, Europe is for us, first of all, the name of an unresolved political problem. In Balibar's statement, which he pronounced in Greece in 2002, so approximately a decade before the country's financial crisis threatened the existence of the Eurozone, raises a number of important and interlinked questions for me about zones of conflict and about imagining Europe and about performative geographies. In this statement, Europe is for us, first of all, the name of an unresolved political problem. I ask to whom, and in the name of whom, is Balibar speaking when he says us? What are the conditions of possibility and forms of mediation through which the collective subject position, the nominal us, becomes articulated as a European public sphere at various historical moments? What are the historical possibilities, improbabilities, contradictions, and risks accompanying various endeavors to envisage a universal, universalizable, but also particular European identity in a global context? So again, while many scholars have been attending to this urgent problem of the United States of Europe, this urgency has not really entered, at least in the United States, I should say that, the status of a kind of inquiry at the level of cultural mediation. And my central claim then is that from the moment of post-war European reconstruction to the present, aesthetic practitioners have been vital contributors to the fabrication of both a discursive and symbolic space in which Europe might materialize, and in which a European public might represent and recognize itself through distinct visual phenomena. I also argue that there's been a central paradigm shift, with post-war cultural initiatives elaborating and exhibiting Europe within the modernist rubric of the nation-state, and contemporary projects contributing to the collective imagination of Europe and its people as a permanent experience of the post-national border. Clearly, the proposition of a shift from nation-state to border state is not without its ambivalences and conflicts, but I hope to elucidate, first of all, certain points of contact and friction through which these epistemes have been mediated through the force of art, and then ultimately offer a suggestion that the zone of conflict is itself embedded in the modernist notion of the nation-state and of Europe, so that what we're looking at today in terms of the post-national border is, of course, always already embedded in this imaginary of the 50s and 60s. And even though my main kind of data today, or point of my visual data is discursive data is Manifesta, I just want to give a little bit of a history of the importance of biennials in shaping this historical inquiry and this historical imaginary. So I argue that Documenta of 1955, the first Documenta, and the Biennale de Paris, 1959 in Paris, were both singular cultural articulations of the challenges facing the nation-state during the construction of the European community in the 50s, while Manifesta gives shape to a new problem of post-national identity in the years surrounding the emergence of the European Union. And this approach to exhibitions is therefore one of performative geography, in which exhibitions are not merely reflecting cultural mechanisms, but actually mapping topographies. That the biennial, of course, while it is the most kind of the most cherished and fetishized object of capitalism, has mapped a kind of dominant geography, but at the same time has managed to reveal that which, let's say, escapes or synthesized or is filtered through these dominant mechanisms as performative geographies of the post-nation state, but also of different kinds of bodies that emerge from it. So, Harut, if I might have my next slide, please. And then the next. All right, here we are back in Europe in 1951. And following World War II, official representations of West Germany and France were closely aligned with the modernist project of the nation-state. And as most of you know, the problem of Franco-German reconciliation. And at the center of this was the role played, at least in foreign policy, of how to rebuild national sovereignty in the wake of the unprecedented European catastrophe and in the framework of new geopolitical realities. So beginning with the Schuman Plan for the European coal and steel community, 1950, integration into a common market, and political integration within supranational institutions was one of the foremost strategies through which to build a durable peace. So this model, again, of building a nation-state through a relationship to the supranational, so the particular in relationship to the universalizable Europe, is the kind of central tension. And the willingness to participate in this model of the nation and the supranational, of course, is kind of a key element. But what is also a key element, of course, already in this model is the place of the other, right? The place of the other that has been exterminated on European soil, the other that has been exiled from a European consciousness, the other that has been repressed within a European discourse, the other that has been relegated to a different part of the modernist project. So again, just setting that up. And if we can move to the next slide. Well, here you see all the important men making important decisions with Adenauer and de Gaulle, and the Treaty of Rome, which officially founded Europe, the modern Europe. And if we can move forward, I just want to stop here for a minute, because in West Germany, of course, how to become a nation-state, a sovereign nation, and rehabilitate German identity was also a question of how to reject a radical nationalism. The radical nationalism that had led to Nazism, and of course how to now reintegrate otherness or do something with this otherness, whether it's in the Degenerate Art Exhibition, degeneracy, or the kind of missing bodies or missing populations, and what to do with that void, if you will, that material void. According to historian Konrad Jarausch, one of the most important concepts guiding German reconstruction was of the post-national nation. So a dual dynamic already in place in the 50s, in which there's a distancing from the racial and national classification of the Third Reich, and an attempt to foster a collective or national feeling of Germanness under different terms. And so during the economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, the alignment, as you all know, with liberal democratic values of the US and its Western allies and an anti-Soviet agenda of NATO was a way to extend beyond the nation into a kind of post-national imaginary. And so the way to confront, I suggest, the conundrum of German identity was to support this supranational Europe as a federal community with its own collective consciousness. But at the same time, this supranational federal community, which looked to the universalizable, which looked to the West, which kind of integrated the kind of Western democratic tradition as the other, was also working through the other others. the kind of Jewish other, the degenerate other, the colonial other, the ones that are not part of this official discourse, basically, that don't make it up to the level of this construct. And so, on the other hand, if we think about what happened in Germany, and here I'm just focusing on this Franco-German binary, for de Gaulle, the way towards a kind of new Europe was through cultivating French grandeur and the nation state, and also by cultivating his own stance, his own identity, his own position as a man who stands for the country, with the country, and there was an immense urgency for de Gaulle to differentiate between what he calls the pays réel, the people, that of the people, the country of the people, and the pays légal, so that of the state and its institutions. And even though for de Gaulle Europe was one that would extend from the Atlantic, famously from the Atlantic to the Urals, here too this kind of tension between the people and the legal status already is a kind of key hinge around which a kind of dominant model of bureaucratic modernism is complicated by all those who don't make it up to the level of this representation of the pays réel, of the people, who are the people, and those of the state, those who cannot be included within its kind of civic system. And here that would be Algerians, for example. It would also be those who disappeared during the war. It would be it would be Indochine, right? It's a whole kind of host of bodies and representations and signs that don't make it into this binary. So framed by these Franco-German efforts, we have Documenta on the one hand that appears in 1955, and the Paris Biennial that appears in 1959 as these official representations through culture, through cultural diplomacy of this new Europe. And of course there are other biennials. Of course there's Venice that comes earlier, there's Sao Paulo that is founded in 1951, but I'm particularly focused on 1955 and 1959 because of the way that the nation state and a modernist nation state, a modernist model, marshaled the collective experience of this large-scale exhibition as a way to kind of align political and cultural messages. My question is, I guess within that, is whether each exhibition, or how close the exhibition was aligned with this process, and how curating and the mechanisms of display enacted a certain geography of Europe and a certain representation of Europe, or whether there was the possibility also of enacting other models within these official representations, whether these were other models of national or supranational collectivities, and whether that was a possibility circa 1955, circa 1959, and that really also helps frame afterwards Manifesta. So rather than kind of positing a total rupture, even though there's an epistemic shift from nation state to border state, I'm saying that this problem of the border and the post-nation and who would be part of this modernist project was already part, obviously, of the nominal us and the nominal us who cannot come into representation. So to return to the critical question posed by Etienne Balibar, can we observe a distinctly European us that becomes legible in these two exhibitions? And at what point did the fiction of a national identity produced by political discourses coincide or diverge with that of a cultural one fabricated by museological institutions and curators? So if we can go to the next slide, please. This is Documenta 1. As you all know, Documenta was supposed to be one exhibition, a single exhibition in 1955. It was not supposed to happen every 5 years. It was supposed to be one exhibition that happened alongside, that was supposed to accompany the German Federal Horticultural Show, a flower show. And this was supposed to be the kind of diversion, the other diversion from the flower show. And it became eventually kind of a repetitive serial exhibition. But the first Documenta that was curated by Arnold Bode and Werner Haftmann in 1955 was titled Documenta Kunst des 20er Jahrhunderts, so the art of the 20th century. And in 1954, Haftmann, an art historian, published Painting in the 20th Century, Malerei im 20er Jahrhundert, a survey of modern art that would serve as Documenta's foundational thesis. And Haftmann's argument and the way that the exhibition was then curated, and unfortunately it's very hard to find great images, but these have to be kind of props for my claim. The exhibition's primary goal was to situate post-war German art within the long perspective of the 20th century and reconnect with the genealogy of modernism that had been interrupted during National Socialism. Here it was to simulate German modernism, by which Haftmann meant abstraction, and only abstraction, into the larger cultural tendencies of post-war Europe. So we have a kind of national project that has moved from a racial specificity during the Nazi regime to a claim for abstraction as a kind of international connection, an international modernism that would most dominantly connect with the United States and kind of liberal Western democracies. So if Nazi cultural policy had framed modernism as an abject part of the social body, which had to be purified and totally eradicated, what we have in Documenta is a way to reinstate modernism as a rightful part of the German tradition, because the Enthauptete Kunst exhibition obviously was the kind of purging of the degenerate. And in response to the degenerate art exhibition, so again, excavating to an even earlier moment, which was supposed to discredit modernism as un-German, what we have here is really a task of rehabilitating and a kind of programmatic effort to reconstitute the German nation, to groom the German nation for a kind of participation in a democratic form of government by looking, by contemplation, right? So it's a kind of recuperation of modernism that positions it as an ideology of individual self-reflexivity. So it's a writing or a curating of this kind of modernism. And here I'm just pointing, first of all, to the, these shots are obviously very framed, but you have this kind of singular fixation on the art object, right? You have this kind of modernist model espoused, especially in the United States, of the kind of singular art object that appeals to the eye, this kind of also Kantian experience of critical evaluation, and self-determination is part of this kind of experience of looking. So by summoning the public to contemplate, right, these modernist art objects that were intertwined with an ideology of critical judgment, Documenta tried to recuperate what the Third Reich had basically staged as a critical reflection in the degenerate art exhibition. So the staging of an empty critical reflection now becomes a staging of the individual who's recuperating their critical judgment through this very kind of singular, autonomous representation and display mechanisms, also in which the art object is not fully kind of aligned with the wall, but becomes part of this, of the viewer's space, not in a round, in this case with painting, but obviously a kind of phenomenological experience that also plays on the older models of the salon, right, and this kind of traditional or classical kind of hanging, not the salon hanging, but let's say the bourgeois kind of model of viewing, but also then brings it into a different ideology. So abstraction, in this sense, and I wish you could see that these were abstract works, but the light is not great, was, again, a kind of manifestation, an ideological manifestation of the Western liberal democratic tradition. And by aligning the subject of the West German subject through this specific curatorial choice, for example, charting abstraction as the dominant strand of modernism, leaving out the figurative, right? Leaving out the so-called primitive. There was leaving out the kind of anti-capitalist avant-gardes. There were certain exclusions in this exhibition. You would not have seen in 1955 Berlin Dada at Documenta. You would not have seen the Russian constructivists. You would not have seen Neue Sachlichkeit artists. You would not have seen revolutionaries like John Hartfield or Kate Kollwitz. You would not have seen the Surrealists. You would not have seen Magritte. You would not have seen Alt Brut, which was of the moment. You would not have seen Jean Dubuffet. You would not have seen Cobra. You saw a kind of very, very specific history of a modernist abstraction. So aligning here the project of the exhibition, which would become Documenta as we know it today, with a German nation state that's aggressively cultivating a self-sufficient power basis, while in this story, of course, this kind of other, the specter of Nazism, the specter of the racialized subject, the specter of the voided communities of Europe, and of the kind of trauma of this erasure, is very much part of this modernist post-nation, if you will. So the exhibition, as I said, to put it in other words, enacted a kind of contradiction of the new German nation state. On the one hand, tentatively and paradoxically rebuilt as a supranational Europe through an articulation of a national sentiment of Germanness from a negative or post-national nationalism. And that's important to keep as one cornerstone as we also think of Manifesta. I'm building this perhaps very slowly and laboriously, but I'm getting to what I'm actually saying is this: Europe was already a zone of conflict, right? It's not only now that we're in the zone of conflict. It has, and the project of reconciliation in the 50s was itself a performative geography. So if we can move now further on, these are more images. So you see, again, kind of Picasso from the 30s hung in the cafeteria, where you could eat and have this modernist experience. If you can move further on, here we are at the Paris Biennial, which was created by André Malraux, the writer who was the cultural minister under Charles de Gaulle, and sponsored by the French state, and inaugurated at the Musée d'Art de la Ville de Paris in 1955, October 2nd, 1959. And the Paris Biennial actually continued until 1985, but I'm only looking at the 59 instantiation here. So again, even though, kind of fixating history for a minute, fixing it, and despite what Raymond Cognat, who directed the exhibition, Malraux was the figurehead, but Cognat was the kind of bureaucrat. Paris, despite saying that this was not about a rivalry with Venice and Sao Paulo, despite saying that this had nothing to do with the war, despite kind of affirming that this was a moment of the presence of youth, this was a way, of course, for Paris to regain its prestige as a cultural capital, which was severely compromised during the German occupation, and to reclaim a kind of primacy that had been, I guess, perhaps even stolen at that moment by Sao Paulo in 1951, the southern primacy, and also of Venice. So, in contrast to the kind of subjugation of the war, and the diminished power of the École de Paris, and of course American ascendancy, what the Biennale de Paris did is also position itself as an international hub, right? As an international kind of locus of youth and liberty. So you see here the activity of youth and is still young. Those who are young and those who are still youthful. And by that they meant that on the one hand there was an age limit. Artists, so this is kind of, you know, we had just been talking about Hans Ulrich Obrist's 1989. Here the kind of the selection committee posited that all artists had to be under 35. So youth culture and this kind of regeneration of youth was extremely important. But avant-garde artists were included as still young, right? So even the kind of earlier modernists were still young. There was also, for the first time, a kind of pedagogical aspect to the biennial. There were conferences discussing the conditions of artistic creation. And the question that guided most of these conferences is, what are young artists searching for? So this emphasis on youth was accompanied also with a particular commitment to artistic liberty under the aegis or under the umbrella of the informel. The informel being the kind of French abstraction of the moment, and positioning the informel as a universal mode of painterly expression. So if we can move to the next image. Oh, sorry, this is actually the inauguration. Can you move back one? Okay. Well, you can barely see it, but there's kind of examples of informel painting there. The informel would be someone like Dubuffet, like Georges Mathieu, like Vols. So a kind of abstraction that would be, in the United States was called abstract expressionism, kind of, you know, chaotic, individualized abstraction, gestural abstraction. And so much like the case of abstraction in Documenta, we have the informel here, within the kind of modernist discourse, that positions a kind of constellation of non-figurative tendencies. And this was a very, very politicized discourse that was given wide currency by art critic Michel Tapier in 1952. And in kind of writing about the informel, Tapier, much like Harold Rosenberg in the United States and Clement Greenberg in the United States, claimed the informel as the space and as the language of the individual. An individual who's able to have collective experiences in that they begin with a space of kind of their own existential position. So political potential of the collective begins with this existential personal potential. And to express oneself in this gestural abstraction is to be young, is to be of the present. And so what we have here is a kind of language, a very Malrauxian, André Malraux. If you've read André Malraux, the kind of Malraux's hero is very much the protagonist of his novels, are very much the kind of elided with this discourse of the individual. So that you have painterly freedom and painterly creation that's based on non-figuration, and that this non-figuration is a space of liberty. And so what is kind of key here in this adventure of liberty is that, of course, it aligns the Biennale de Paris with de Gaulle's political project of the state and of France, who are independent from other political powers. And so in the Gaullist rhetoric of the period was very much about national prestige, and the prestige of the individual, and the prestige of France as an individual kind of entity. And to enter Europe, to become part of this confederation, France would have to remain independent. So there are kind of two different discursive models in France and in Germany about how to enter the supranational, how to enter the universalizable European consciousness in relationship to a specific project of the nation state. On the one hand, in Germany, you have the singular model of the nation state in which the individual has to somehow get rid of the abject, right? Get rid of the other by aligning itself with the United States, with a kind of liberal Western democracy. And in France, there's a support for a kind of national consciousness that also enters a confederation or European consciousness by maintaining its universalizable French kind of republican tradition of the individual and of the individual who's French, right? With all of this kind of, by negating the particular, And what I want to say here in this kind of early history, which is, taking a while to form, is that cultural mediation in both of these exhibitions was very much aligned with the project of the nation state. And yet, in each one, there were actually moments of rupture that or at least moments that have been narrated as rupture, but in fact are also kind of avoiding the colonialist other, the kind of other problems of the post-national already within the story of modernism. And if we go to the next image, we'll see, for example, so you see at the opening, Malraux is standing with, on the second from the right, in front of a work by Jean Tinguely. This is Jean Tinguely's Curious Machine, the Metamatic, which basically created abstract gestures through a mechanized motor. And you see, obviously, it's a lot of fun. These bureaucrats having a lot of fun. But what this kind of did, the way this has been narrated, at least, is that you have these youth, this kind of neo-avant-garde that is complicating abstraction, that is complicating the individual through mechanicity, through other forms of mediation, through a kind of disorder of that model of the individual, the kind of French individual of the Reconstruction period. And so there's this, again, this kind of heroic story of the neo-avant-garde that is somehow complicating the model of the nation state. And if we go to the next image, here you have the kind of, this was the performance at the opening of the Metamatic. So there you have Tinguely on the left, and you have a performer kind of running around the work, helping it kind of work, performing around it. And that is another example of the work kind of close up, a different version in which you have the machine painting, the machine being this kind of subject, right, with its own random disorder, with its own disobedience to this, this kind of rhetoric of the individual. If we go into the next image, you also have, as part of this kind of counter-narrative to the national, to the biennial, instances of artists like Julio Leparc or Horacio Garcia Rossi, who were both Argentinian artists who had come to France. There was a whole community of Latin American expats, including Carlos Cruz Diaz, for example, and Victor Vasarely, from the East. And there's a story here, the kind of narration of a disruption also by the neo-avant-garde, by a kind of phenomenological art practice that also appealed to the individual through a kind of phenomenological, optical interpolation, but was actually trying to, or attempting to destabilize the eye, the kind of informal eye, the informel, the kind of, the eye of liberty is now becoming, through this kind of optical disruption, somehow opening up to something particular within the universalizable. And my claim is that even though we have these kind of neo-avant-garde heroic disruptions, obviously this is still completely incorporated into the kind of official cultural mechanisms, and that coming in 1959, at the height of the Algerian War, at the height of kind of a civil war that is only called the Events, euphemistically, in France, there are questions here of decolonization, there are questions here of others who could not be part of this post-national nation. So even though you have certain artists who have been elevated to the level of, again, kind of disruptive mechanisms in this loop of cultural mediations, this too is part of this kind of modernist narrative that needs to be obviously further complicated by looking at other spaces, and other instances and other representations that were complicating this kind of relationship between the individual, the supra-individual, and the collective. And so in this zone of conflict, in this map that is already kind of being established between 1955 and 1959, you have a geography that is very, very obviously normative. It's Franco-German, and you have an attempt at mediating between the individual and the collective under different terms, but it's still very much of the same. And the kind of otherness that's in these official representations, in this zone of conflict, on the one hand, opens up to the possibilities of a kind of post-national through abstraction, but also stops short, very much stops short. And so but nevertheless, this is again the biennial now. So I'm historicizing the biennial in order to also see what a particular biennial is doing today, which is Manifesta. So if we could move now to the next image. So you've all probably been to Manifesta, heard of Manifesta. If you haven't, then I'll be happy to tell you all about it. In the intervening years, since 55 and 59, obviously we've had shifts in the global landscape in which there are different conditions of possibility through which to engage with the concepts of Europe. And the most prominent kind of cultural initiative, again, kind of official initiative, I'm looking at official culture here, is one known as Manifesta, which is the European Biennial of Contemporary Art, which was inaugurated in 1996 in Rotterdam. And this is a biennial that emerged from a Dutch government initiative in the early 1990s. And according to its organizers, responded to political and cultural shifts that were heralded by the fall of the Berlin Wall, the perceived lack of exhibition opportunities for younger artists at an international level, and the kind of hardening or ossification of existing biennial models. So in order to engage with the broader notion of the new Europe, always the new, the Manifesta tried to create, according to, again, official discourse, networks of emerging artists that would be, quote, less susceptible to the market and the media, unquote, and to avoid the bureaucratic, nationally focused homogeneity of the Venice Biennial. So the foundation, the main organizational body is called the Foundation European Art Manifestation. That was the original body that organized it from 1993 to 1999. And later, from 1999 to the present, the organizational body is called International Foundation Manifesta. And they both made a series of very important decisions in order to distance Manifesta from other biennials. The first decision, if you can turn to the next slide, please, is that let me see. Is that the exhibition would be itinerant. It would move every 2 years. So every 2 years, a different city. It would have a different financial model. So again, rather than it being a Dutch cultural initiative only funded by the Dutch government, or the biennial being a French, Paris Biennial being a French initiative, etc. Here, all organizations that are taking part in this exhibition, all participating organizations, have to pay the same fee. And there's a mandate that the choice of artists would not be based on national representations. So there are no quotas in terms of which artists from each country. There's a shared financial structure that privileges the commonality of Europe above the nation state. And there's also, like any other good biennial in this day and age, processes, dialogues, curatorial practices that are being discussed, you know, in other venues as part of a kind of pedagogical supplement. And this, of course, is to disperse one authorial voice. So at the same time as we have kind of mega curators, like Hu Hanru and Okhui and Nicolas Bourriot and all the others, the first 5 editions were basically organized by, were selected by submissions. So the curators who were chosen came from different backgrounds, experiences, and tastes, and rather than coming as a team, they were brought together by the organization. And they were obliged to work together to create this exhibition. So this was the methodology of the first 5 exhibitions. After that, teams started to apply. But the first 5 was a kind of matchmaking service by Manifesta. And this was an attempt to preclude a singular voice. But of course it had its setbacks. And so in 2006, Manifesta asked teams to apply, and this became now the dominant model. Now, there's also, as I said, a range of activities that are educational, seminars, publications, etc., pedagogical, participatory, that extend beyond the life of the exhibition. And so what the Manifesta organizers have said this has done, their claim, is that it has now satisfied pan-European ambitions in this uniquely nomadic nature. And what this nomadic nature does is develop, quote, a fast-growing network for young professionals, offering a platform for emerging artists, establishing close dialogue between specific cultural and artistic institutions. So, briefly, we have a kind of rhetoric that doesn't simply reflect the existing territory or the concepts of Europe, I think, but also uses curatorial, aesthetic, administrative, and pedagogical strategies to map and manufacture a certain European cultural topography. And if we move to the next image, I've made a little kind of blitzkrieg map of Europe with Manifesta as the blitz. So you see different sites where Manifesta has happened. And of course, for the Manifesta organizers, these are non-centers. So Frankfurt is not a center, Luxembourg is not a center, and in this network you have a kind of decentralization of any particular kind of hub. And the question, I mean, there are very complex methodological problems. How does one, for example, analyze an exhibition which has had 9 different editions, right? In 9 distinct locations, sometimes different sites within a heterogeneous geographical region. How does one account for different artworks within the exhibition? How does the artwork interact with the overarching curatorial structure? How much interpretive weight do you give the output of press material and catalogs? And of course, in the same way that